Ultimately, one of the things that I think people need to remember is that if you live in Gaza, and I was reporting there for many years and have spent time there since in the last 15 or so years, for the majority of Palestinians there's 2.5 million of them roughly. It's a blockade imposed by Israel and Egypt. And that means basically you don't have freedom of movement, you can't leave when you want, you can't say study outside the country very easily. But the truth is that when you occupy a people for decades, and I say that as someone who is Jewish, I'm a Jewish German Australian, and I've reported on this issue for 20 or so years, that I am surprised by obviously the timing of this, but at the same time not at all surprised by the reasons behind it. That a lot of people in the Palestinian movement, both in Australia and around the world, are so infuriated with years and years of Western silence on this. I'm talking about from Australia, US, Europe and elsewhere, that somehow there's a belief that you can lock people up, occupy them. And of course, let's not forget, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International and others have called what's happening in Palestine apartheid. That's their words. Every Israeli human rights organisation has called it apartheid. If that is the case for years, and it is, and I've reported on that myself, as have other journalists, eventually people will snap. People will break. You cannot continue to behave like this as a Jewish state, a self-described moral state, and expect Palestinians simply to lie down and accept it.
Of course.
We can get outraged in the West about the taking of civilians back into Gaza, fine, but there's far less outrage about the fact that every day this year, and for every year for decades, Palestinian civilians are killed in the West Bank and Gaza. They are killed by Israeli forces. That gets far less international outrage. Now, they're both wrong. Killing civilians is always wrong, regardless of who does it and where. But ultimately, to me, I think that double standard in so much how we as journalists report this is, in my view, a big part of the problem. But ultimately, what it shows is that the current status quo is not sustainable. It is not sustainable. You can keep on occupying a people for decades and decades and decades. And it's important to note, this is the longest occupation in modern times. It's the longest occupation. And yet now we get outraged by what Hamas does rather than getting equally outraged by a day-to-day grinding occupation. And to me, I think Arab states are going to be put under huge amounts of pressure to not support Israel, or at least be far less supportive of it because of what's happening at the moment.